So the second thing I want to discuss with you before we jump into the text is what is the play about? Who are the main characters? It's not Merchant of Venice. And it's not Shylock. It's Ophelia. Ophelia has more lines in this play than any other character by quite a long measure. And she is often, as I've mentioned before, considered to be one of the most intelligent, if not the most intelligent, woman in Shakespeare's plays, in any of Shakespeare's plays. And so much of this play is about her relationship with Bassanio. And but more than that, the play is also about bonds. And jot this down. I'm going to give you 5 types of bonds that we see in Merchant of Venice. Bonds, of course, are sort of more of an older word for covenants, for contracts. You're in bondage to someone. You bail out of a bail bond. So the word bond has a long history, both negative and connotative, and negative and positive. In this play, we have the first major bond that we see is the bond between Portia and her dead father. And we see that right there in Act 1. She is decreed, her dead father has decreed that she marry only under these conditions. And she, of course, is fighting for the romantic idea of marriage. She wants a romantic marriage. She doesn't want to have to marry who her father makes her marry, but she is indebted to him. She cannot break this bond that her dead father imposed on her. The second bond we see is the bond between Bassanio and Antonio's money. Bassanio, in order to marry his beloved, has to have money, and so he's in debt to Antonio. The third bond is Antonio is in debt to Shylock. He has taken out a huge loan, and he will repay it. If he cannot repay it, he has to pay it back in a pound of his own flesh. And then the fourth bond is the bond between Shylock and the law. Shylock says, "I crave the law in the courts." He believes in the impartiality of the Venetian law. So the Venetians might be terrible people. They might be haters of Jews, but they are people of the law. They are a type of democracy. They are rule based, and so he trusts in the rule of law in the modern city-state of Venice, and he craves the law, and he gets the law in ways that he doesn't want. And then the fifth bond we're going to see here, generally speaking, is what's called the marriage bond, because this play is about a lot of marriages. It's the marriage bond, what the Bible calls the marriage debt. Now, what is the marriage debt? Well, the marriage debt, let me read to you what St. Paul says the marriage debt is. This comes from 1 Corinthians 7:3. The husband should fulfill his marital debt to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. It's a two-way debt. So what is this debt? But Paul says, because there is so much sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital debt to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife does. Whoever called St. Paul a misogynist? This was radical stuff in the first century, where women were considered property. They didn't have rights until St. Paul came along and said, when you married, your woman, your wife, she owns your body. You better give it. So the marital debt is sex. So paying the marital debt. And again, this was a strong idea in early modern society. But does Shakespeare base this play and the sort of the ideas of marriage in this play on the biblical ideas of marital debt, or more radically the ideas in Ephesians 5, where Paul says to the woman, hey, the only thing you've got to do is to obey your husband. That's it. Husband. Oh, let me go through this. Husband, you've got to love your wife like you love your own body. You've got to sacrifice your body for her. You have to lay down your life for her. You have to treat her as Christ treated the church. You have to be willing to be crucified for her if need be. On and on and on. The debt that husbands have to pay their wives is far heavier than the debt the wives have to pay the husbands. So in this fantastic relationship between Ophelia and Bassanio, we will see how essentially how brilliantly Ophelia usurps the bond which her father, the dead father, has imposed upon her. But actually, I want you to read Act 3, Scene 2 carefully before we talk more closely about the way Portia brilliantly renegotiated the typical Elizabethan marriage contract with Bassanio. She held him to a far higher standard than was ever required in Elizabethan ideas. So we'll get to that in Act 3. But I just wanted to conclude this section with an observation briefly on how Shakespeare has always subverted Elizabethan and sometimes biblical, oftentimes classical, Petrarchan ideas of love. We first saw this, of course, in Love Labour's Lost. We saw how the four main lovers represented four different types of ancient or medieval love that Shakespeare made a lot of fun of. It is a parody of the Neoplatonic love that you saw. It is a parody of Petrarchan love. It is a parody of courtly love, and perhaps even a parody of Dantean love. That's perhaps debatable, but there were four types of love that we saw there that Shakespeare was having a lot of fun with. And then we saw in, of course, Midsummer Night's Dream, we saw the subversion of Athenian love, the arranged marriage that we see. The lovers essentially rebelled against the arranged marriage or the war marriages that we saw there, and they run away into the forest. Because where else can you go if you're going to violate the norms of your culture? You have to leave the city and go to the forest. It happens in so many plays. So they run away to the forest, and there they finally get involved with romantic love, or with a bit of pixie dust thrown in, as we know. But then, of course, they all come back to the city at the end, and everything's kind of like, the carnival's at an end, and everything goes back to normal again. So, and of course, we see in Romeo and Juliet, if they wanted to subvert the arranged marriages of their culture, they had to run away, and we saw how that went. And then, of course, in Merchant of Venice, we're going to see this again, how Portia subverts her father's arranged marriage decree, how she subverts the Elizabethan ground rules of women having to be 100% submitted to their husbands. She went right back to Ephesians 5, and she insisted on her rights under Ephesians 5 to be loved 100%. And we'll see that. She brilliantly makes the deal essentially with her husband that if I'm going to obey you, you had better sacrifice your life for me. Lay it down, be willing to die for me. And if you can promise me that, yes, I'll submit myself to you. So, so these are the bonds that we see, and we're going to be seeing throughout this play. We'll see again bonds in the whole economic structure of the play, bonds in the marital structure of the play, bonds in the legal structure of the play. Everyone is calling on some sort of rule of law, from Shylock to Portia to Bassanio, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we're going to see balances out these bonds is the whole balance that we can see between justice and mercy. My old professor from University of Texas, Frederick Turner, wrote a book on the economics of Shakespeare, and he describes how brilliantly Shakespeare manages to subvert so many of the expectations, not only in this play but in other plays, and appeals to higher authorities than to Elizabethan culture. Going back sometimes to Socrates, Aristotle, going back to scripture very often, and calling upon higher powers in order to subvert the ideas of marriage and economics and so on and so forth. So let's jump into Act 1.